Okay, our next talk. Alexander Magidow is an assistant professor of Arabic at the University of Rhode Island. Yonatan Belinkov is a graduate student in electrical engineering and computer science at MIT. So he's the real thing, right? Their talk is entitled Digital Philology and the History of Written Arabic.
Good morning, everyone. I think that our paper, we are not historians per se. We're interested in the history of language in this particular project. I'm interested in the history of language. We're not historians per se, but I think that our work is going to follow up very well on a theme that we're seeing, which is the cyborg approach to research, which is melding the sort of computational with the blood, sweat, and tears of a human researcher. And that's why I called it digital philology. And actually, linguistics isn't, the people talked about the tension of old school methods and new school methods. Linguistics people are more or less okay with anything, but if you are submitting to old school people, saying the word philology makes them happy. If you're talking to new people, philology makes them angry. So I was hoping with historians around that philology would come off well here. So I'm interested in the history of Arabic, and what I would like to know is, can we use these corpora, which in many other languages are working out very well, to research all sorts of amazing things about about languages? Can we use that for Arabic? Well, here's the problem. Our corpora are more or less in standard Arabic, or written Arabic, or whatever term you want to use. I'm going to use the term el-Fusha, partially because I'm an Arabist, and partially because that's a really nice term used in the Arab world for all written Arabic, basically. They don't differentiate in the same way in general between classical Arabic and modern standard Arabic, which is the differentiation made by American scholars and European scholars about the written Arabic language. Part of the reason why we have to focus on this is because the people who type texts into computers that are millions of words long, I can't imagine how awful a job that is, but those crazy Saudis who are doing that, they're not going to digitize things in general that are in colloquial Arabic. Right? Even the Middle Arabic sort of texts just don't make it into these archives really very much. So we're kind of just looking at written Arabic. The research question I have is, well, can you classify written Arabic, this thing that is often said as in the Arabic term, which is so unchanging as to just need one term? Can you differentiate it into eras? Can we say there's early classical or early written Arabic, middle written Arabic, later written Arabic? The term Middle Arabic is a terrible term because it's been appropriated for a really confusing set of terminology. But basically, do these era divisions, can we make era divisions? What about the current era division between classical Arabic and modern standard Arabic? Does that stand up to scrutiny? So that's one of our big research questions. Our other question is, are there other eras? Can we, using a variety of computational methods, talk about, well, these words came into vogue and went out of vogue at a certain time, this construction was used at a certain time. Can we say 5th century Arabic looks like X? Can a computer say that? So we're interested in what are the linguistics characteristics of those eras if they do exist. And I call it our pseudo-research question, because this is what we're really working on, is how on earth do we figure any of this out? So we're using a Maktaba Shamila, and we are so indebted to Maxim Romanov, it is just impossible for us to say how indebted we are to him, because he's done so much crazy work. He showed me the work he was doing one day, and he's like, do you want to help? I'm like, I don't even understand how to help. All right? He's done some amazing stuff.
Sort of massage his shoulders while he's...
I swear to God, that was the only thing that I got out of that. I was like, yeah, I could do that, approximately that. So he's really cleaned up the Maktaba Shamila records and corpus. It's a text collection of mostly religious texts. I think we were joking, he called it the Salafi canon. It's a particular view on what religious texts are, but in the theme of the conference, it is a perfectly Islamic archive, right? It is done by a bunch of Islamists. It has a bias towards formal Arabic. There's a few modern colloquial texts that I found when I was trying to see if old texts used colloquial words. It has about 6,500 texts, but about 1,000 of those are not dated, and we are working on the ones that are dated. We have about 800 million words in the dated texts, because we're lazy and haven't figured out how to date the other ones without a lot of work. We date everything in this presentation on date of death, almost always in Hijri years, because that's what Shamila uses, and I don't feel like fighting with Excel any more than I already have. The earliest text is the Diwan Labid, which they date to 41 Hijri, based on his date of death. But there's not a lot of poetry or anything in this archive, unfortunately. I was going to make this beautiful chart. I know exactly what I want the chart to look like, but I do not know how to make the chart. So here's just a random sampling of some of the genres. You can see that there's an interaction between genre and year. So hadith texts, their average date, 355, right? You look at biographies, 735 is the average date for things that are listed as that genre. Shamila has crazy genres. Their genre terminology makes no sense, and we haven't gone around to cleaning that up anymore. But you can just sort of see that there's going to be an interaction between genre and date, which means that that's also going to influence sometimes our linguistic research. And that's something we need to work on. When people do linguistics research with corpuses, corpora, they usually clean them up quite a bit first. And we haven't done as much of that as we should. This is a beautiful chart from Maxime, who makes beautiful charts, from his dissertation of how many words there are per century. This is from his dissertation. You can look it up. It's online. So you just get a sense that there are also spikes in production at certain times. So we have more texts from certain centuries than from others. We're just telling you all this so that you don't take our results far too seriously. Okay, there's some other issues. One thing I keep finding is introductions in modern standard Arabic. So you have somebody introducing a text that is all written recently, talking about the text that is old, but when you do a concordance, that early stuff all gets picked up just as much as anything else. Maxime has done an amazing job of getting rid of all the footnotes and moving them to endnotes, and he has a tag that says endnotes, and it's impossible to miss, so when I run my concordancer, it just stops at the word endnotes, and I'm good. But all this introductory stuff is really hard to get rid of or ignore. There's a lot of repetition of quoted material, which is just the nature of the Islamic archive, right? People quoting other people. But that means that when we're trying to do all this research, I don't think it turns out nearly as well because we keep getting the same text over and over again, so it's hard to say this is a 12th century text if it quotes 5th century texts over and over again. So we need to figure out ways to eliminate that. And apparently Maxime's been working on that project a little bit, and we need to start stealing his results, continue taking stuff from Maxime. There are very few literary texts. I don't know how much it would help us to get poetry, because poetry is, in Arabic especially, is all about obscure words that nobody else uses. I don't know if that would help us, but it would be nice to get more literary texts into our corpus and really flesh it out. I think what we need is a super corpus. And I think that that's something that we shouldn't just have on mine and Yonatan's computer hard drives. This should be online somewhere. It's hard to find hosting for 11 gigabytes of text, and we'd be adding to that. So we're still trying to figure out how to do this exactly. Okay, so the first set of approaches that we've tried are what we call bottom-up approaches, and that's where we just throw the computer at it and hope for the best, rather than, sorry, I'm being a little flip, but this is going from the data up rather than our ideas down. So one approach we tried was new words over time. Right, so this is a cumulative chart of new words over time. You have the date down here, how many of the words as a percentage, so up to 100%. This measure is useless, basically, for the first 250 years, because of course all of the new words are going to come because the computer's seeing all these new words, right? It's not wonderful as a measure until you get to this sort of flatter asymptote. On the other hand, we do have a really good result where if you look at new words over time, we get a big jump in the slope of this line right around sort of the Nahda, right? So it seems to jump right around 1300, which is 1882, right when people are publishing lots of newspapers. And there's a lot of texts in the archive from that, writing books in what is now called Modern Standard Arabic. So there's some evidence for Modern Standard Arabic being different from Classical Arabic, at least in terms of having all these new words. Is there another bump? It's not as big a bump, but maybe there's another bump here. This also corresponds really well to a spike in number of words in that century, in terms of the total number of words in the archive in that century. So maybe it's just that as people are writing more, you get more new words in there. Word lifespans. This is another approach we've been taking. Again, this title could also be called Understanding Arabic Using the Kitchen Sink. We're taking a bunch of different approaches, trying to figure out how we can figure these things out. So this chart might be a little confusing. What it is a chart on the x-axis is the first usage of a word, and on the y-axis is the last usage of a word. So that diagonal slope 1 line that you see right there is words which are used only once. That makes sense? Anything above that line means that it's used twice at least. Anything clustering at the top means that it is still basically in use today. You notice how much of a cluster there is at the top? There's not a whole lot of words that are used briefly and then disappear. So that's an interesting result. I've tried to quantify this with some sort of descriptive statistics. The average lifespan of Arabic words in our archive, and remember, this is an Islamist sort of archive. There's a strong tendency to quote, that we haven't gotten rid of quotes, there's a strong tendency to use archaic language as a way to show up your bona fides as being like, I'm really steeped in this tradition, right? So we're expecting a little extra. But the average lifespan is about 1,160 years. The median lifespan is 1261, so a lot of these words last a really long time. We have another slide that I'll show you in a second where we tried to compare this with English. And because our English corpus is only about 200 years old, I tried to quantify this as average lifespan as a percentage of the remaining time window, right? So if a word starts in 600 and continues to the end, that's sort of 100% of its window, right? If it starts in 600 and ends in 700 and doesn't go to 1440, which is the last date that we use in our corpus, then it has a much smaller percentage of that window as its lifespan. Does that make sense? It's trying to make these things a little comparable. And if it divides by 0, brand new words, I counted those as 1, which probably skews the results a little bit. We tried to make a chart for English, and it is useless. I'm very sorry. Our data is by decade for English, and so I tried to jitter it, and all it did was produce these solid blocks of random jitter, because we just have so much data, and we haven't found a principled way to eliminate data other than just decimating it at random. So we don't really have a great idea of how to show it on a chart. But if you look at the average lifespan, we have a 68-year lifespan, but again, it's a 200-year archive, right? So to normalize this in some way, as a percentage of the remaining time window, it's 41%. And if you'll recall, this is 52% of the remaining time window, so it does seem like Arabic words stick around longer in our corpus than in our English corpus, if that makes sense. All right, and I'm going to turn it over to Yonatan, who usually handles a lot of this technical stuff, and I don't get it, so I'll let him explain the word vectors.
Okay. So we thought about another way to look at word meanings, and that is to basically represent the words geometrically as vectors in space. And I think it's similar to a lot of different things that we saw earlier in David's work. The main assumption is that you can figure out the meaning of the word by the context where it appears, the distributional hypothesis, and we want to have words that have similar meanings to have similar vectors. A vector is just a point in space or a point in the 2D space or in the plane, if you don't know what that means mathematically. So we have some ways to create those vectors that I'm not going to talk about much here, but essentially given a large corpus of text, like the entire Shamila corpus, we can get a point in space or a vector for each word. And the nice property is that if the words are similar, then they'll lie somewhere near in the vector space. So words like nakhel and thamar have some similar meanings of fruits and dates, and their points or their vectors are close to each other, much more than a word like mahabba is, okay, love. So that's the main property that we want, and we do see it qualitatively at least. And now comes the question of what we do with that, and since we're interested in the historical change of the language, we want to see how we can use that to maybe quantify change over time. And we got some help with people, Chaim Dubrinsky and other people from Hebrew University, and use their method to measure the change across different centuries. So you can imagine creating such word vectors or points in space for consecutive centuries and see how these words move in space. So maybe the word mahabba moves closer to Thamar for some unknown reason, and the Nakhal and Thamar move farther apart. So that's the main idea. Okay. Just to give you some example of what these plots turn up like, you can take all these vectors they live in some very high dimensional space and project them to the plane, to something 2D that people can actually look and understand. And we've circled some words that seem to be common. In the middle, you see all these prayer terms. You have some words for like distance, like ba'id and qarib on the right-hand side, and on the bottom, manzil and dar. So generally, you will see words that have similar meanings clustered together by this algorithm. Okay, so this is one plot that we had that tries to quantify the change over time. And this shows, so there are two lines here. The one in blue shows the change over time as we measure it by our word vectors. And the numbers here mean what is the distance between consecutive periods in time. So you can take the same word, get vectors for the same word in 2 consecutive centuries, and measure the distance between these 2 vectors. And if the word, our assumption is if the word's meaning has changed a lot, then there will be a big distance in space. And the green line shows just the word count for the respective centuries. So there seems to be some correlation between points in time where there's a lot of word usage to points in time where there's a lot of change in the meaning of the word. And we're not absolutely sure why that might be the case. So one reason could be that when people write more, then it's an indication of the word meanings changing. But we still haven't verified that our method is not sensitive to the count of the words. So another reason could be just we have a larger corpus. Maybe that's affecting our method in some way. We think it's not, but we're not absolutely sure. We do see the nice rise in word change towards the modern period, which is what our research question went to look. But we also see this rise around the 700 Hijri year, which we can't really explain historically in some very clear way. So with this, I'll hand over to Alex.
Thank you, Yonatan. So that chart was actually an average across all these words that we had. We had a big Excel spreadsheet. They averaged it. We have an Excel spreadsheet of 6,000 words or something like that. So what I was wondering is, can I use that knowledge that X word changed in Y century a lot relative to the change of other words in that century? Can I use that to create a concordance and really do sort of philology, read through the concordance, try to make sense of what the changes in meanings were? And that is in theory possible, but it is really hard, really, really hard. When you look at jargon words, it's actually quite easy. So one word that was indicated as being highly changeable was the word mawquf, which had a ton of different meanings, but they were all very much related to sort of the jargon of Islamic law. And that's cool and interesting, but it is endless, right? At what like, unless we have a particular word we're particularly interested in, because me and Yonatan are not scholars of Islamic law, we don't know what's interesting necessarily. We can't. It becomes a question of what's our project? Is our project to create an OED etymological historical dictionary of Arabic, which is an amazing project, right? Wouldn't that be awesome? Wouldn't that be so fascinating to be able to look up a word and see all of its changing meanings really drilled down into by scholars who are steeped in that tradition? I think that'd be very interesting. So what we tried to do was look more at functional words, words like the word khilal, right, which is used for a lot of different things. It's not really jargon per se. It's not just a noun. It's more of a functional word that's used within the discourse to connect things in a way that jargon isn't. Jargon is sort of the point of the discourse, not the connective parts of the discourse. But try as I might and stare at as many concordances as I want, I still have not figured out, I have not cracked khilal. I have not figured out what it meant earlier on and what changes it underwent exactly that seem to be indicated by our word vector changes. And it's also possible that just the changing context, right, because this is dependent on context, the changing context itself, right, because you're talking about different things in these centuries, it might be that that changing context seems to be throwing off our measurements. So then I was thinking about ways that we can just approach this from another direction, from our intuitions and other people's intuitions about the language, and see if that can lead us towards certain things. So I was bumming around Facebook, as I will do, and somebody posted one of these little memes, which I've always found to be extremely patronizing and worthy of study in and of themselves as a form of what we call verbal hygiene, as a way to police other people's speech. But what it is, it's a meme telling you what not to say and what to say. Well, what is the source of say and not say literature? It's often this very classicizing idea that Arabic shouldn't have changed and we should talk the way we did in the first century or something along those lines. So I was interested, is this really classicizing? And can it be a helpful tool to figure out what changes have happened? Because here's somebody's intuitions about the changes in words that are already occurring. So we have two examples. He says, don't say nawaya as the plural of niya, intent or desire, sort of. Say niyet, say this plural, right? And none of our measures so far can handle that plural thing. The word vectors, I don't think we've found a way to really handle plurals and look at two different plurals and see how those change automatically over time. So this just requires a certain amount of grunt work. And then his other one is hawali. Hawali means around. And like English around in modern usage, it can be used to talk about space or number. He says, don't talk about number using around, use these other words. It's not appropriate. You can only talk about space with it. So I did look into niya and its plurals, nawaya and niyet. And indeed, if you look at the Shamila corpus, you have much more usage of niyet than you have nawaya. And this is where the weakness of having this very Islamic corpus comes into play, where you can see on the side here, I actually did a search in Arabi corpus, which is a corpus of a variety of things, but I did a search in the modern newspapers section of it. And you'll find that nawaya is much, much more common, by a factor of almost 3 or 4, than niyet. But if you look in the pre-modern corpus on Arabi corpus, just to check with the same tool, it's the opposite. So it does seem like niyet is a more classicizing way of pluralizing this word. So the meme has something to it. Now for hawali, I feel like this is our big success story so far, because we found a really nice, clear example of the first usage of it to mean using it to talk about number. So early usages, and I'm sorry if this is super tiny, and I don't believe in transliterating extremely lengthy group pieces of Arabic text, because if you can't read Arabic, you can't probably make sense of the transliteration either. But anyway, so at the land known as Badakar, and they would, around the use of the ocean, undertake attacks, right? So it's talking about aroundness in space, right? And these contexts, both of them could be bridge contexts, where you could understand it either as physically encircling or as being in the approximate area of, right? It's only, and again, these examples are from like the 3rd and 4th centuries. It's only towards, at the end of the 6th century that I'm really seeing, I found a good, clear example of this word to mean number. I noticed that I had to skip over a lot of examples of it being used for number. They're clearly from the introductions to these works. So I have this giant spreadsheet I have to go through. I feel like I've trained myself to be this computational system that can tell you whether something is classical Arabic or modern Arabic within a 10-word segment. If I could like figure out how to turn that into a computer program, it would work really well. But you can see this example. I brought him 200 pieces, and he gave it to me for a price of around 200,000 dirhams. And then he gave me this other thing that's worth about thereabouts, right? It's using approximately for number here. And that's been one of our big success stories, which makes me wonder whether going more deeply into the say, don't say literature might be a really interesting jumping off point as a top-down approach. And of course, it turns out that our word vectors, which I'd kind of glanced at, but a little bit ignored in this part of the project, do suggest that around the 5th and 6th centuries it is changing in its meaning. And then it changes even more in modern terms. But again, this is picking up, I think, a lot of those introductions. And if I could eliminate those somehow, I think that the data would be so much clearer and it would really zoom us in very much more efficiently. So conclusion, with regards to our research question, there is some apparent difference between modern standard Arabic and classical Arabic. This is not a huge surprise, right? There's enough people talking about it and writing lengthy articles about it that it's not a big surprise. There might be some other errors, and we're still teasing that out. Words last longer in Arabic than English, it seems, which is not a huge surprise, right? We can't read an old English text very easily that's 1,000 years old, but I can read a 1,000-year-old Arabic text fairly easily, even though I've been mostly trained in modern standard Arabic. There are definitely changes that happened prior to the modern era, right? You can't say that Arabic didn't change until the until the Nahda era. It's changing. We clearly have this very clear change in like the 6th century, right? Things have changed in the past, and that's the kind of thing that we want to zoom in on a little bit further. Our methodology, the word vectors have been helpful but not perfect. For example, we don't have a good way of doing that plural search, right? If we hadn't had somebody sort of give us that idea, we would never really would have thought of it. I need a better way to drill down into my concordances. Right now, I just put them into a CSV file, I had to write my own concordancing program because I want to include metadata from the archive, and most programs don't do that without me renaming all the files so that it shows up that way. So it makes a nice thing where you have a line, the little concordance chunk, the date, the author naming if you want to look for author-specific effects and stuff like that. But I need a better way to drill down further into that. I've done all sorts of crazy stuff with Excel. And then we have started a little bit of a project to just have the computer automatically use it to train itself on text. So it can say this is probably a 5th century text, this is probably a 6th century text. And it's worked pretty well, but we're still sort of hashing through the results. It's a real world problem because SHAML has a lot of undated texts, and we're trying to figure out if we can use that tool to help us date them. And usually the tool is very confused, and then we find out that it's actually just a collection of hadith texts from 5 different centuries, and that's why the computer's so very confused. So it's been a bit of an interesting project. We need to clean up the corpus, and maybe if we want to do English comparisons, find a better one. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Alexander and to Yonatan. Maybe you guys could take one question while I set everything up for mine. That'd be cool.
I have a question or question/suggestion.
And we really want those.
I just curious, you actually mentioned the OED in your talk. And I was wondering if you guys had thought for doing a comparison with English of using the OED's proposed origin dates for words, 13th century, 15th century, as a means of estimating the length of the lifetime of an English word.
Oh, that's a really interesting one. I don't know if we'd end up getting a modern cutoff or not.
I don't know if you get a modern, sometimes it'll
Say obsolete, I think, OBS.
Yeah.
So there's a way to maybe like pull out the obsolete ones, you could get a length. Or if nothing else, you'd have a sense of like, assuming the word, I guess, yeah, you wouldn't know if it's gone out of usage, but.
Is it though a measure of, is it a date of the actual first usage, or is it more of an etymological information of maybe some ancestor, some prior word or ancestor word to that?
That's a good question. If I'm not mistaken, I haven't looked at the OED in a while,
Okay.
but it'll have, maybe everyone could correct me, but I was under the impression that they'll have sort of by meaning, and then the first usage by that meaning.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's how it works.
But I think it'd be easy to get the digital version, and you could OCR it, and, I mean, it's only 20
Well,
volumes.
it's probably been digitized.
Yeah, it's available on their website.
Okay, cool. One of my little show and tells is not going to work out, but that's okay. All right, great. Well, my co-author is not here, but that's okay. I do want to mention him. He is an undergraduate named Henry Wallace. And I just want to say a little bit about how this project got started. I taught a course last year in the Department of Comparative Literature called Before Wikipedia. And the course is about the history of encyclopedic literature. And I had about 20 kids in the class, and the fact that it was called Before Wikipedia, it attracted a large number of non-literature majors, a lot of scientists, mostly scientists. I think I had 1 or 2 English majors or complement majors. And the rest were engineers and computer scientists. And because of the word at Wikipedia, I think they thought it was going to be like this Wikipedia course. And there was an interesting component where Wikipedia featured in the curriculum itself. And for the first assignment, I asked the students to, we had read an excerpt from the Roman encyclopedist Pliny the Elder, his Natural History, which is one of the earliest encyclopedic texts in the Roman tradition. And I asked the students as an assignment to pick a topic that was not covered by Pliny and to write the natural history entry for that topic in Pliny's style, because he has a very characteristic style. And so I wanted them to pay attention, through close reading, basically, to the features of his style, at least as they were represented in the translation, and then to write a Pliny-esque article. And so I had things like, articles about like Chick-fil-A and, the iPod and stuff. And it was actually and Kanye West. And it was a great exercise, and they really got into it, and they nailed Plinian syntax just perfectly. One of the students in the course, a student named Henry Wallace, who's a double major here at Brown in computer science and mathematics, decided that instead of writing it himself, he would download an electronic version of the entire natural history, which is 10 volumes, off the internet. He found an OCR version on the internet, and analyze the entire thing using latent semantic analysis, and then build a little software program that would generate Plinian syntax articles, basically. And that's what he submitted as his assignment. And I read it, I just could not believe, it was pitch perfect. It didn't make any sense. The sentences didn't really make any sense, but they sounded like Pliny. They were really, really interesting. He was sort of unsatisfied with it. But I knew, I wrote an article for the New Yorker a few months ago about the experience of working with Henry on this, which you can find online. It's called Hacking the Humanities. And I knew that I had to hire this kid because I was working on this Arabic program. He doesn't have any Arabic at all, but we had this great collaboration where we kind of spent the semester building this tool that I'm going to talk about. And so I just wanted to say, I thought he might actually show up at some point, but Henry is my co-author on this, and we're hopefully going to turn this into an article and publish it. Okay, so what are we doing here? My interest was basically to work with, I'm a little bit afraid of working with, for the things that I'm interested in this project, working with prose, the kinds of corpora that Alexander and Yonatan were talking about, doesn't really make any sense. For me, my starting point, which I think is unproblematic, is that corpora with a lot of regularity and structure within them, natively within them, are low-hanging fruits for this type of scholarship, for distant reading. So the less you have to do to a corpus to configure it in certain ways, to structure it in certain ways, the easier time you'll have for certain kinds of pattern recognition, okay? And I think we can all agree about that. If we accept that starting point, then when we look to the different candidates, at least in the Arabic world, we arrive at the next starting point, I think, which is also unproblematic, that as a highly patterned literary form, classical Arabic poetry represents a discourse that is particularly well suited to digital modes of analysis. The conventions of rhyme, meter, and genre conspire, together with a Semitic root-based morphology, to natively configure a literary archive in ways that invite distant reading. And this archive is also highly self-referential and relatively closed. At least when we're talking about the canon. I mean, it's not like anything, first of all, not anything can be a classical Arabic poem. Not anything can be a legitimate legal prose sentence either, but you have you have so much more variety in what can constitute prose than what can constitute poetry. I mean, the rules for what qualifies as a poem, once you have set the parameters of rhyme and genre and length and meter, are very narrow, right? Something either is or is not. And so for that reason, I think it becomes interesting to study that corpus, which is a hugely important corpus culturally speaking, but also one that I think is quite manageable. So what did we set out to do? Sorry. Okay. I came to this topic from studying very, very large works, encyclopedic texts from the Mameluke period. And the text that I know best is by an Egyptian encyclopedist named Shahabuddin al-Nuwairi, who died in 1333. And his great work is called Nihayat al-Arab fi Funun al-Adab, the ultimate ambition in the arts of erudition. I've been translating this work. It's a 33-volume work. I've been condensing it to a 1-volume anthology, which will be published next year with Penguin Classics in August. So for the past 2 years, I've been working on this translation of this huge text and distillation of it. And in the course of doing that, I've read a ton of poetry. And I've read a ton of poetry that is arranged topically. This is one of the features of this encyclopedia. So for example, in his chapter on trees and fruit, or his section on trees and fruit, he has a chapter called On Trees Whose Fruit Has an Inedible Peel, a chapter called On Trees Whose Fruit Has an Inedible Stone, and then On Trees Whose Fruit Has Neither Peel Nor Stone. Okay? And each one of these chapters, he has multiple sub-chapters. So in the first chapter, you've got basically nuts, things that have inedible husks, almonds, walnuts, so on. And then you've got trees with fruits that are essentially stone fruits, olives, plums, so on. And then you've got things that don't have either inedible husk or a stone. If you drill down beyond that, you come to, let's take for example the fig. You have a chapter or subchapter on the fig that contains a description of the fig, its sort of beneficial properties, how you what it's good to, why you would eat it, under what kinds of medical conditions. This is all drawn from Ibn Sina and Ibn Wahshiyya. And then there's a lot of poetry. There's poetry on the fig. Who has written poems about the fig? And it's usually not an entire poem about the fig. It's usually a little bit taken out of a longer poem, and there's like a little metaphor in the course of that poem where he mentions a fig. So for example, we have a very famous poem, or an excerpt from a poem by Ibn Khafaja describing figs gathered in the morning. I won't read the Arabic. The translation is, "Dark, the color of mountains, they laugh at the frowning gloom. Then, as the forenoon light breaks, they are freckles in the morning's face. It is as though I were gathering in the morning the small breasts of Abyssinian girls." So this is what, this obviously the painting is not from the manuscript. This is a European painting. But the metaphor is a ripe fig is likened to the small breast of an Ethiopian girl, a pubescent Ethiopian girl. Very striking image. And one that it turns out is utterly conventional, especially after Ibn Khafaja. That if you're going to put a fig in your poem, you're going to liken it to the breasts of an Abyssinian girl. If the fig is so ripe that the skin is splitting in your poem, you're going to probably liken it to the wounded head of an African slave, right? So that dark skin with slashes on it and the blood coming out, that becomes the conventional way to liken to describe a fig, right? If you're going to put a banana in your poem, you're going to want to usually have it described as like an elephant tusk dipped in gold, right? The standard way of describing bananas. And there's a couple others as well, right? So reading this kind of reading this poetry, when it's organized this way, you come to the realization of just how conventional a lot of this poetry is. Conventional, from a post-romantic perspective, is a bad word, right? We're not comfortable with convention. If you say, oh yeah, that poem is totally conventional, or it's a totally conventional novel or something, you're usually dissing something. You're saying that it's like, you know, it's been done before. In this poetry, having the poem do things that have been done before is sometimes the point. It's sometimes to engage with a mode of description that demonstrates how learned you are and how literate you are, right? So I'm very interested in this aesthetic posture for reasons that I'll go into a little bit more towards the end of my talk, for reasons that have to do with music, because I think that this is an aesthetic posture that is actually alive to us, not in literature but in music, and I'll go into that a little bit more towards the end. So Henry and I decided to try to model some of these manneristic tendencies in this poetry using distant reading approaches. And so in order to do that, we began with a classic text that describes tropes in poetry by Ibn al-Mu'taz, a poet and a caliph for a day, and the author of one of the first really, really important literary critical manuals, Kitab al-Badi', which attempts to define certain tropes that he found in the poetry of the so-called moderns. And the moderns are not modern, they're early Abbasid poets, so he's talking about the poets of his time. So what are some of the features that he identified in this poetry? Isti'ara, figurative metaphor, tajnis, paranomasia, including puns, homonymy, alliteration, etc. Mutabaqa, antithesis. So when you have within a certain line, you contrast. You have like opposite pairs, white and black, up and down, things like that. Rad a'jaz al-kalam, where this is basically the rhyme word at the end of a line is foreshadowed at the beginning of the line. So the first word in the line is also the last word. In other words, the poet is telling you where he's going. It's either at the beginning of the line or at the end of the first hemistitch or the beginning of the second hemistitch. And there's something called madhab kalami, theologism, which is another one of his tropes we don't have to get into. And of course, tashbih, which is simile. So Ibn al-Mu'taz says these, and then he has a bunch of other ones as well, these are features of this new poetry. These are features of this new style that you don't find as much in the ancient poetry, in the pre-Islamic poetry. But part of his, or at least this is what he says. He says that people of his time think that the people who really hate the new poetry think that it's not like the old poetry, it's not like the Quran. And one of his projects is to say, actually, if we really go through the new poetry and find all these tropes that you say characterize it, we can find them in the old poetry. And he provides examples of that. We can find them in the Quran. So his work is a kind of apologetics for a new style. So using Ibn al-Mu'taz's definitions, Henry and I we sat down and said, okay, what can we do? What can we model manneristically? Which of these can we actually teach a computer to find? So we began by, first of all, building a corpus. We had to build a corpus of poems, which we found on the internet. We basically found, there's like tons of these poetry databases online. We found one that was going to work with a web scraper. We scraped all these poems. We basically built a corpus of about 6,000 poems, each one in its own text file. And we had an Excel document that where the file names were correlated with the author, and decided to begin with two seemingly easy things to model. The first one is tashbih, simile, which is easy to model because there are only a few ways to make a legal simile. just like in English, right? A simile has to begin with
Like.
or as, like or as. Everybody knows that, right, from elementary school. Same thing in Arabic. You begin a simile with one of the adat al-shabah, which is like ka, ka'anna, kama, mithl. There's like 11 of them, right? So if you can tell a computer, whenever you encounter this, the thing after it is probably going to be a simile, right? And because of the muscular nature of Arabic poetry, where you can't play fast and loose with words. I mean, everything is metered and timed, and like there's only a certain number of words you can fit into a line. Only the really crucial words are there. Okay, so we thought that this would be a good way of doing this. And the other one that was an obvious candidate was Rad A'jaz al-Kalam, which we called the rhyme echo, which is a very easy thing to model syntactically because you're just telling the computer, look at the last word of every line and see if it appears as the first word or halfway through in these 2 points. We wanted to test this idea that this thing that we think we know about classical Arabic poetry, which is that the presence of tropes, of these kind of like manneristic devices, increases over time. So this is like a visual representation of the corpus, of all the poems in the corpus. This is line length, the y-axis. And this is just like the number, basically. And these are the different symbols correspond to the different poets. We built this, all these different functions that relate to the different devices we were talking about. This is all in Python. Relying heavily, as Peter will probably see in here, relying heavily on the context-specific search that is described in this article that Peter and Jose wrote for the volume I mentioned. And we have, in the case of similes, we have what appears to be the exact opposite thing that we would suspect, which is that you have beginning with Imru al-Qais, so like the beginning of Arabic literature, right, and moving forward. What you seem to have is like the poet with the most similes is the oldest poet. Not he should have been down here. It should have gone like that, right? Instead, it goes down.
What's the y-axis?
Frequency of the similes. Okay. In the case of the rhyme echoes, it is what we would expect, right? It does seem to Imr al-Qais. There are no rhyme echoes in his poetry, and then as you move forward in time towards Ash-Shab al-Dharif, you end up with the most. So that's what it looks like, right? So we did some other things with this. Henry wanted to try out various other ways of clustering documents based on a topic modeling approach. I can't explain what we did here, but he tells me that it was not successful. Psalm clustering, Hellinger distance, this is probably something that Yonatan could explain to us. But they're pretty graphs and they make me look smart, but I'm not. Okay, so the point is that there are, I think every digital humanities talk that involves some level of, especially distant reading, this is kind of a feature of the style, people who do this, is that you like show the really exciting graph, then you're like, yeah, but there are all these problems, and actually we didn't find what we were going to find, but this makes for an interesting talk, and let's all learn from this, which is kind of an annoying thing to do over and over again. But it is the case that with the similes and the rhyme echoes, there are all kinds of methodological problems. And here, again, this is why I'd like to go back to the comments opening the conference. Close reading is totally crucial to any kind of distant reading project. I mean, if there's one thing that this sort of exercise has done is that you spend so much time reading the text in your corpus and going back and trying to figure out why this strange result is there that sometimes it feels like you may as well just be doing this all without a computer. Right? So in the case of the similes, the result, I felt there were things that, first of all, there were a lot of false positives. It was picking up things that were not similes, but that met the legal rules that we had given to the algorithm. In other cases, there was a problem of frequency distribution. So, one of the early poets, it looks like he has a ton of similes, so the frequency is really high. But that's just because we didn't have that many poems by him. And in one of the poems, there were 8 similes. So all of a sudden, it looks like he's somebody who uses a ton of similes. Whereas other poets, we had like 1,000 poems by them. And so naturally, it's going to be different. So we're kind of ironing that kind of thing out. The last thing I want to talk about is the future of the project. What I'm really kind of interested in is what I began with, which is this idea of conventionality. And to me, like the best way to measure conventionality is, or one of the best ways to measure conventionality is by really trying to measure imitation. And imitation is something that's a very old problem in Arabic literary historiography. It's this idea that's called sariqat, literally thefts, poetic thefts, plagiarism. It's something that the medieval literary critics were really interested in, and made it a kind of like almost like a parlor game, to be able to read a poem and say, oh yeah, he got this from this person, or he got this from this person. It was an accepted way of demonstrating one's poetic chops, basically by lifting lines from other people. And there was even this concept in the medieval literary tradition of ghazu, literally raiding. Okay, so if a poet felt like he was a greater poet than some other poet, he would raid that poet's oeuvre and say, that line is too good for him. That's my line, right? I'm more entitled to that line than this other schmo was, right? So I'm going to take that line, now it's going to be my line, okay? And so I'm really interested by that approach to aesthetic appreciation of a poem. And here, this is what I was talking about earlier about with respect to music. I'm a musician. I have been studying jazz for several years. And I remember when I was studying jazz, jazz piano, my teacher would tell me things like, I would go for my lesson, we'd be working on a new piece or something, and he would say, you have to go listen to these 5 solos by great musicians, not all pianists, right? You have to go listen to this, we're studying this particular piece, and you want to learn this solo, you need to go listen to that, and you need to go watch this video on YouTube of like Bill Evans playing this piece, and you need to look at his hands, and you need to imitate not only his solo note for note, but you need to imitate the way he puts his hands on the piano. You have to basically, you're not allowed to improvise in this art form until you can imitate exactly the guys that came before you, until you can sound like Bill Evans or Wynton Kelly or whoever it is on the piano. Once you can sound like them, only then do you begin to have the vocabulary to be able to produce your own stuff. And I kind of feel like there's probably some kind of a dynamic like that going on in the classical poetic tradition. I sort of feel that to learn how to be a poet meant learning how to imitate the style of other poets, learning how to take their lines, right? Learning how to take half of a line of like a well-known line by this previous poet and then coming up with some interesting response to it in the next line so that people would recognize it, right? So this is kind of like what we're working on next, which is basically to create out of the corpus essentially a theft bot, right? A bot, and this is easy to do. It's really easy to do. It requires basically, there's all kinds of different similarity detectors where essentially the bot will sort of fly through the entire corpus and find similar lines and half lines and try to get a sense of like who is lifting things directly from somebody else, who is, which kinds of like conventional descriptions come up over and over and over again. And the idea here is not so much so that we, as scholars of literature in the 21st century, can look at this corpus, right, and say, here is the history of plagiarism, right? I'm less interested in that from my perspective as I am from the archive itself, what it meant to be a poet working in the tradition itself. So I'll give you a sense of this and I'll be done. So here's like the corpus as it looks from our perspective, right? A given poet's corpus, a poet within that tradition didn't have this whole corpus in front of him. What he had was probably a much more limited corpus. He probably was aware of like just the poems that are in red. Or just these poems. Like if you're a poet in, I don't know, 13th century Cordoba, your poetic education might be confined to the poems that were in two really well-known anthologies that had been published like 50 years earlier. That was the extent of your poetic education. And that explains why your poetry looks a lot like the poems in that collection, right? If you were a poet in 16th century Cairo, maybe your poetic corpus, your archive, was much bigger. And so maybe that explains why your poetry looks different. So the idea is ultimately to be able to model the individual corpus of a given poet within that collection, right? To see what the view of the Arabic literary tradition was from the perspective of somebody within the history itself. To be able to model what they knew and then test that against, not test it, but like run their oeuvre against the things that they knew, not against the entire collection. That's sort of like what we're hopefully trying to do next. And I think that's all I got. Thank you. So I guess you guys want to come up here and we'll just take some questions and then. So we've got about 15 minutes for questions. Yeah, Matt.
Thank you. All the talks were all really fascinating. And yes, I'm particularly interested in yours just because my own area of research is medieval Persian poetry. So I was wondering, you had made the comment that you guys had tried some topic modeling on, like you said, you kind of said it didn't work, or what was it just didn't produce anything interesting? Do you have any more? I'm interested because it's been used for genre studies, and that's one of the aspects I'm really interested in. So, just
we couldn't get it to work. We didn't try that hard, but Maxime Romanov, whose name keeps coming up, so we should all say hi to Maxime. And Maxime's watching this on webcast. We miss you, Maxime. Maxime is going to be giving a talk after lunch, but there were some visa issues, or not visa issues. It was really mail issues. Deutsche Post sort of lost his passport. So, but Maxime had expressed some skepticism about making the topic modeling work for reasons having to do with lemmatization, I think. And
sure. I mean, that makes sense. I think that's something that has to be considered. So in our work, we lemmatized everything. And it might not be a good thing to do, but at least you have to try because of the morphological nature of the language. If you work on poetry, getting a good lemmatization is going to be tricky because the programs that exist out there mainly work on modern standard Arabic. So, basically finding the canonical form of the word. Sometimes it's called stemming, sometimes they have different definitions, but you want to find a canonical dictionary form of the word that abstracts away from all the conjugation or declination.
so in English, knives belongs to the lemma knife, right?
Yep.
It's way easier in English.
So it's easier in English, but I haven't thought that much about this, but I couldn't think, besides like broken plurals and stuff, why is it so difficult in Arabic?
Well, well, the ambiguity level is very high. A lot of it has to do with the lack of vowels. So, since you don't have vowels and other diacritics, the surface form of the word is very ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to disambiguate, and you get a lot of different words conflating to the same surface form because of that.
Sure.
And lemmatization is one way to deal with that.
Right.
Actually, for your issue,
I mean, for our project, the topic modeling doesn't really tell us that much that's very interesting for poetry anyway, I think.
I guess for your simile, you mentioned that you had some issues with finding this ka, for example, might not be a real simile, just the beginning of the word.
Right.
Say.
There's
So-
false positives, yeah.
Yeah, these are things that you can handle with a morphological analyzer, an automatic tool that
Yeah.
will deal with that.
Just absurdity for somebody who just learned what the word Latinization means. I think this Rich Nielsen person, who's a political scientist who worked with Arabic, apparently his dissertation came up with some way of dealing with these stems. So I'm not a programmer, but that might be a way.
Let me just interject. Maxime sent over Twitter. He said, just in reading conference, we have some interesting progress on topic modeling! Exclamation point. So, wish he was here to explain that.
Thanks, Maxine.
Thank you for the talk. So I guess there are different English translations for parts of those Islamic archives. So I'm not sure how it fits your problem, but like you can think of shared representations for words. So I know that you're both computer scientists. So
Sorry, of what?
like the shared representations, like you can use the English side to align the word embeddings or vector spaces of different like words, like Hawali
Yep.
can be about in, for example, this century, but not in the other century. And as you know, there are a bunch of like works on multilingual word embeddings
Yep.
and like CCA and stuff like that.
Yep.
So have you ever tried using parallel data to find these changes?
No. I think it's a cool idea. So basically, some of the ambiguity may be resolved by the parallel data, and of course we can get those word vectors or embeddings for multilingual corpora. But we haven't tried it, and I think there will be a major problem with aligning the texts from Shamila to their English translations. I just don't know of these alignments.
Like,
Or
like word aligners like Giza that does that.
no, but just do you know if Shamila gives you the English translations as well?
I'm not talking about Shamila in particular.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the whole Islamic archive. Like there are a bunch of like separate translations here and there that belong to some specific time in history.
Yeah. We need volume, right?
I feel also that it's going to be the people who do translations tend to protect their copyrights a lot better than the people who do produce the things that are in Shamila. So it might be harder for us to get digital copies of that to play with.
I guess we also need a large volume of texts, right? So Shamila is very huge. I don't know how large of a corpus of parallel texts you can get for those, but do you know of resources? Maybe we can talk about it later. Yeah.
It is both huge and not. Like sometimes you'll get 2 instances of a word in an entire century in spite of 800 million words because it's distributed across 14 centuries. So it is a little weird, the results you get.
I had a question, reflection for both presentations, which I'm in love with this conference. I'm really enjoying myself.
So for the digital philology project, I think there's an interesting kind of, I'm not a linguist, so I'm outside my field, but you have obviously a combination of sort of the natural drift of a language combined with the influence of prescriptive grammars and prescriptive type works. And I was wondering, because I know classically there were these works, you know, like Western grammar prescribes certain sorts of syntactical structures that the Kupins might have not thought were overly restrictive and things like that. Is there a way you could show, especially given the importance of grammar in the historical educational tradition, that you can sort of see a kind of a limitation of the kinds of things that are done as a function of the rise of this grammatical work that prescribed it? I mean, an example that comes to mind is I remember, like, the Russians make a big stink, you're supposed to always repeat the preposition. So, to this place and to this place. And if you could kind of catch that over time, sort of that phenomenon rising or falling as a function of educational shifts, that was a thought or a question. And then similarly for Elias, I was going to ask, I don't know as much about the history of poetry education. I think you alluded to it, implying that a poet's training was in part of the function of reading the canonical anthology of your region. But was there any kind of more formalized poetic education historically? And if so, were there certain canonical works you could look for? In other words, if there was sort of a good poem has the following features, can you show the impact of that prescriptive work on the poetic tradition?
Well, that would be I think that would be a reasonable hypothesis, and that would certainly be something that we would hope to show, that when the emergence of a text, of a literary critical text that goes on to become hugely influential as a school text, like something like Sakaki's Miftah, and then Al-Qazwini's like abridgment of that, and that becomes like one of the most widely read, Talkhis al-Miftah, like most widely read works of literary criticism, that is like, it's something you just have to know. And actually Ibn Khaldun is one of the only people who addresses the question of, he says, I asked my teachers which texts you need to have studied in order to become an adib, like a literature. And that question is very easily answered in the case of law or the case of like medicine or whatever, but it's less easy to identify in the case of literature. And he said these are the 4 texts, and then there's like Adab al-Katib, Ibn Qutayba, and then there's like 3 other ones. So yeah, I think that if you had a corpus that was like, had all the poems in that collection, so 14th century, North Africa, Egypt, Mameluke territories, this is the kind of stuff that people in madrasas were learning when they were entering the madrasa as teenagers and studying law and studying literature. These are the poems that they learned, right? In the same way that you're learning piano, these are the pieces that you learn. Then it would be interesting to kind of like run a poet's oeuvre, or a whole school of poets, their oeuvres against that basic background, in the same way that you would run it against the Quran, or you would run it against things that everybody knew.
And in response to your question suggestion, that sounds awesome. We'll get on that eventually.
I think we talked a little bit about tracking syntactic changes, so it's...
It's tricky. One of those say, don't say things was syntax, and I did try to look at it. Oh, I don't remember what it is. It's on the slide, but it was a prepositional prepositional complement, like which one should you use, or Katab Risala illa or le, right? Something like that. And I tried to do it. The problem is simply that is another level of complexity which requires you to handle syntactic analysis, because that le could come anywhere from a couple words after to dozens, and that's where it gets a little more difficult. We'd have to do some sort of syntactic analysis of the corpus, and that's where I would call up Yonatan and be like, how do we do this? And he'd say, oh, that's going to be really hard.
Well, right now we have a version of the corpus which has morphological analysis. So for each word, we know what the morphological, hopefully the correct, it's automatic, hopefully the correct morphological analysis, but you don't have syntax there, or hardly any syntax. So there are tools to parse the entire corpus to syntactic trees. That's not a trivial task to do, yeah.
Well, and like I think someone had suggested at one point to us, or we thought about like word order. Do you have?
Yeah.
That's one of the things people say. Classical Arabic is VSO. Modern Standard Arabic has more SVO, right? How do you determine when a sentence is started in a classical Arabic text?
VSO, verb, subject, object.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was a linguistics major in college. So.
But I mean, how do you do that, right? Is it after a wa or a fa, right? Because a lot of these don't even have punctuation. Punctuation's more recent or thrown in by the editor. And what counts as a sentence? I mean, that's a huge can of worms.
Yeah, but I like the idea of using the grammatical works of the Kufan and Bassan. It can be like the say, don't say for syntax, right?
Yeah.
Is it that hard to reorder the classic Arabic to look like modern Standard Arabic?
Sorry?
Is it very tricky to reorder the like the old Arabic to make it look like Standard Arabic?
I can just tell you how by spending a lot of time staring at concordances, you get a very, like, humans are amazing statistical learning machines. And so I've done a very good job, I think, of statistically learning the differences, because I can be like, no, that's clearly from the introduction. And some of it's very, like, if I was a computer, it would be like, there are numbers written in as numbers and not as words in this line, right? I can tell that's modern, right? But there's definitely a character and flavor to classical Arabic that's different from modern standard Arabic. And it's very hard for me to intuitively define that, but with the tool that we've been working on a little bit of just having the computer figure it out, it works really pretty well so far. We're still verifying, and that takes a lot of time. And it keeps coming up with these very confused results, and it turns out that the texts are just, it's a mishmash of text from several centuries, so we're still working on that a little bit.
Okay, well, it's lunchtime, and we'll maybe continue over lunch. Everybody's invited to lunch. It is going to be on the 3rd floor. So what you want to do is kind of go out to the lobby and turn right, walk all the way down to the end of the Watson. You can either take the elevator that's there up to the 3rd floor, or take the steps up to the Koo Library, and we'll recontinue here at 1 o'clock. And if you're on the after lunch panel, come see me so we can sort out the presentations. Okay? Thank you.